Digimon Survive just came out, and I'm excited. I've never been this early to a Digimon video before, so let's... fuck off. There's no way. Before we start, I hate visual novels. Words benefit little from having an anemic anime child straddle them. I'd much rather read a real novel, and I only read non-fiction for good reason, but then a lot of non-fiction ends up being fiction in a non-narrative sense. Well, whatever, not my problem. I do love strategy RPGs though, so why are you laughing? Functionally, we're greeted with the Digimon classic. A bunch of kids get sucked to a foreign land, meet with a digital partner, then painfully drag their ass across invisible squares to engage with foes who die in 1 or 2 hits, and that's Survive. Bridging the seemingly endless combat is exploration, wherein we're given control of a pointer and can sweep the surface of a pseudo-panoramic landscape by tagging points of interest. It could be a common feature in visual novels. I'm not a pedophile, I wouldn't know, but the way the camera zooms and pans between characters, focusing on the current subject with the background perspective changing as your eyes dart around, was pretty engaging. It's hardly a substitute for actual animation or movement, but as these sections take place from a first-person perspective, there's an immersive aspect which doubles as an attention grabber. Ticks that retentive part of your brain which is strung out from whatever you do all the time. Having free control of the cursor felt like an explorative endeavour, allowing you to scour maps, peering for potentially hidden detail. Maybe some things passed me by, a victim to my lack of attentiveness, but giving a manual comb over was empowering. And then there's the other side, where you hit a button and it snaps to the next thing, turning it into a checklist of noise. You are hand-fed a selective portion of what's actually on offer. I opted away from snapping to events, at least at first, as it itemized my progress and took away that sense of wonder in what I may find. Ideally, this is how the game would function throughout, and the snap feature would be unnecessary, but when you're reusing the same maps, retreading the same narrative beats, and are heavily encouraged to do a second playthrough, it does reduce a lot of tedium. It pains me to say that I was feeding myself events like cattle. I'd abandoned the manual scrub, but a few more unique maps with visual points of interest would have carried the feature further. The best maps had lockers or discoloured floors, which were natural draws, but the worst areas were indistinct, reused, and bland, not something I actively wanted to search. How many times can I manually wave over the same tree line in hopes I find some ribs? Why does every thoroughfare look exactly the same as the last? There is something to be said of familiarity, signalling safety and known knowns in your mystery world. You know, the safe room, the bonfire. These features offer immense benefit without explicitly signposting. But as reusing maps have no functional purpose, I'd say they sold us out so they didn't have to add 1 or 2 more backgrounds. Nobody likes drawing backgrounds, but when that's all you've got to convey what's around you, position yourself in this world where you should be invested. Even a few more perspectives of the same areas could have given us a clearer understanding of the space, a bit more novelty, intrigue, frame a known space in a way that makes it unknown. When you really break it down, you stare at the same 5 character stills and like 20 overall backgrounds for about 30 hours, and that's insane. Over-relying on cheap padding goes double for the phone mechanic, where at any point during exploration you can bring up your phone's camera to sniff out distortions, which are invisible events that either yield an item or an encounter. It sounds great on paper, but was completely misused. After the first couple chapters, this function is unrequired until the end of the game, and even prior to that, the protagonist gets a text during a major story moment and says verbatim, "I forgot I even had my cell phone." Nothing I say comes anywhere close to that self-own. That's an admission. Lock that dude up. Wouldn't be an issue at all if it was optional and purely a tool for rewarding a vigilant, consistent searcher. However, if there is a distortion in the map, Takuma, the player character, will comment on how he feels there's a distortion there and we should use our phone to check it. I've already done that, and then I was asked to recheck it with a cheap overlay, which defeats the point. Why can't I simply find bandages in the bush without looking at my phone? In pretty much every interaction, this mechanic begs you to double up and adds a middleman to exploration, which is actively detrimental. Am I exploring unfamiliar terrain, or am I still in the fucking tutorial, bro? You gotta tell me. You don't have to use it that often. I know the point is that you're not supposed to uncover everything. The game is crammed with so much shit that even if you miss out, you are not want for item. But I'm unsure of the reasoning behind undercutting half of your gameplay portions with mixed up conflicting design. That's not even addressing the tangible in-world justification for why a phone's camera manifests physical items you previously couldn't interact with. My best guess would be some sort of in-world encryption algorithm, but even that doesn't make a lot of sense. We can see Agumon and the big evil guys, sometimes, but a small group of Digimon hiding in the bushes can only be engaged through your cellular device. Survive was in development purgatory for a while, so it's possible they were grappling with their own conflicting systems and compromised to where it's functional, but not wholly sensical or good. Oh, you know, the kids check their phone every 5 seconds, so like if we put that in the game, they'll reflexively know how to utilize the mechanic, said the board member. As an extension of this criticism, the fact that the narrative progression strings you along with anime breadcrumbs and you're unable to bypass chunks of it with good detective work is trying. Particularly in the early game, where the solution's evident and you can't simply say, hey, the cobweb's in the roof, it's probably a spider, or like, hey, that door-shaped rock, yeah, that's a door. Like, that's just bad writing, likely typed on a mobile phone. Nothing typed by someone's thumbs has ever been important.
I don't know about you, but I don't have time to read nothing that a motherfucker type with his thumbs.
I'm a Tactics Ogre fan, so you know I skip more showers than I take and get real intimate when I converse. I'm too tactics-pilled to understand personal space, but Digimon Survive isn't that. You can speak to anyone from anywhere, digitally. At any point during combat, a player character can speak to either their own monsters to buff them or wild monsters for potential recruitment, and I'm of two minds. In a standard strategy RPG, if you want to talk to a bloke, you've got to be right on him. In Fire Emblem, Tactics Ogre, other, speaking to a character requires adjacency. I can't think of a single game wherein the sound travels farther than a square. This likely speaks to the noise amid the shambles of war and what kind of scale one square is meant to represent. It is both a mechanical restriction as well as a world-building consideration. With that said, these other tactical titles are also based more on positioning. A poorly positioned unit will see them killed permanently, whereas Survive lacks permadeath itself and becomes more about moving really quickly, so grouping two dudes up to have a little chit-chat would likely make these already excessive maps even more of a hurdle. It's not that they're overly large, it's that the movement range is so low when there is comparatively little to factor in. With a couple monsters and a couple treasure chests to collect per battle, and again with the positioning factor rarely being demanded, most maps exist to walk from one end to the other, slaughtering weak foes along the way. And that sucks at 3 to 4 panels per turn. Minoru and Falcomon genuinely give the best buff as it increases your movement range, God bless them. Since I'm already comparing Survive to, I guess its contemporaries, does this happen in other games? Yeah, absolutely. Fire Emblem and Tactics Ogre, my two primary examples, have their fair share of waddle maps, but because positioning is the most important factor, even waddling can be made punishing outside of just being bland. Mate, the amount of times I've carelessly sent a character too far forward just to save a turn, only to get one shot by a rogue Wyvern Knight whose range I didn't check, definitely more than once. Now don't get me wrong, that kind of punishment can be seen in Survive, at least on the hard difficulty and in the early game, but it never truly feels like foes scale with the allies. Once you got a group of champions, the challenge drops off severely, and with every extra form it falls lower and lower. Speaking to Monsters reveals the Mega 10 Who Wants to Be a Millionaire answer tree, wherein you've got to best guess how to get through to your chaotic adversaries in as few attempts as possible. Much like in my personal life, I'd always lock in the wrong answers, but if you brute force any system, you'll eventually learn how to converse with others. Even if you're a Digimon fan. The freely recruitable Digimon are a fantastic natural addition that unfortunately get overshadowed by the story monsters. Of course you'd need monsters you can use in any context when there's a threat of your primary characters dying, like that's of course, right? But they're far more varied. Once evolved, they stay there. They have countless utility, but they have no social skills. They're unable to speak, despite being recruited through speech. Speech buffs are simply too good not to use, so unless you've got a spare slot or didn't get to play a character's later evolutions, you're almost certainly not using free-range monsters. Said buffs are so overpowered, they have no range, can be used once per combat and grant all sorts of boons, such as increasing stats, healing a monster, and I think that's it, it's buffs or healing, but it's still better than not having it. There's also Affinity, which only the charactered monsters have, and in addition to being responsible for digivolving to forms beyond a champion, it also has smaller secondary effects such as HP and SP recovery at the end of a turn, as well as combo attacks. These are minor things, they're hardly necessary, but if I pitch to you the contrast, you're choosing friends with benefits every time. As you can't exactly increase affinity with yourself, Takuma and Agumon have the Karma system, which effectively just dictates which evolution tree you'll go down. The rest of the survivors have to fight for theirs in that you need to select the correct dialogue tree responses and pray they like what you've said. Hang on, they've used this exact mechanic before in Digimon Adventure for the PSP. You were given dialogue trees and endgame megas were rewarded if you hit the correct responses, only you couldn't save scum in that game, you just had to look them up. Did Survive wear it better? Yeah, absolutely. Though you'd think 10 years after the fact they'd refined the system to more than a chaotic yes or no checkbox. I'm not saying answers should be entirely predictable, but some of the answers are so absurd it makes the characters seem borderline schizophrenic at times. Though, that's not exactly out of character for a bunch of children in a life or death survival situation. Expecting them to feel the same way about events and philosophical musings day after day might be a bit much, but then it also draws into question where the line of gamification ends and the survival narrative begins, but I don't even think the developers knew the answer. To say you're getting a generic narrative is underselling it, but not by a lot. Everything is foreshadowed, built up to extremely obvious once it gets rolling. I know the game's old, but the rest of the video is going to be solely addressing the narrative, so here is your spoiler warning. As the title states, the crux of the story is to navigate Digimon and survive against all odds, but the last part is where it's been tweaked. Half of your party fails the second command, and there's nothing you can do about it. I don't mind this so much. I've seen a lot of people complain about it. I don't think it's that bad. After clocking the game, I wouldn't say I regret not being able to save anyone on the first go around. It's wholly realistic that some people will be killed, though some scenarios, they're a little more believable than others. Let's quickly introduce the characters. You've got Takuma, he's the everyman, he's the player vessel, but only sometimes he'll randomly gain sentience, and he's a dullard, a genuinely dumb guy, and not just because I'm him. Minoru, the quirky, wholesome big chungus best friend who is goofy and smiling all the time. Aoi is the prim and proper, responsible faux mother. Saki is the easygoing ditzy blonde. Ryo, the tough boy who thinks he can punch his way out of any situation. And finally, Kaito, the grumpy, overly serious elder brother of Miyu, a goofy girl child. Did I forget someone? Kaito is the only character who understands that to survive, tough calls must be made, and he is all too willing to make them, despite not being the leader. This can lead to a frustrating time, a little inner party tension, until you realize they're like 12 years old, and were they not fighting a hostile island full of digital monsters, they'd be skirming for victory royales and chanting 6-7. Standing alongside these colourful characters are their accompanying monsters who serve as contrast to their personalities, almost like some sort of alternate persona, which is actually a keen insight into a deeper, darker part of themselves to reckon with and to overcome. Minoru, the best friend character, is airheaded, indecisive, panics easily, where his monster, Falcomon, is authoritative, learned, calm. Falcomon is a necessary contrast to Minoru, serving as a Tard Wrangler, but at the same time his massive movement range and speed in combat is reflective of Minoru's hasty, unthinking actions. Shuuji, the abusive authority. Everyone's fucking paying attention now, let's go boy! He's the opposite of Minoru, and one of the only people to make Minoru snap. No one likes Shuuji, not even Shinji, which is part of his character development, but no one cares enough to take it seriously. His partner is in Lopmon, who's a lovely little dude, shy, reserved, feels like he's holding the party back, effectively what Shinji thinks himself to be, despite his outward posturing. His inability to reason with his own fragility is why he loathes Lopmon and actively abuses him. It's awful. Shinji sucks. Ryo, aggressive, angry, violent, secretly a coward. He fronts hard, spews a lot of threats, but follows up on very few, which is why he finds a companion in Kunemon, who speaks only in buggy grunts. Kunemon is a reflection of his partner, completely stunted, his words mean nothing, and the only worth he has is in his actions. Also, despite being violent on paper, Ryo never abuses his partner. I think the only person he actually punches is Shinji. Good. Kaito's pretty one note, he's rarely relaxed, focused on saving his sister and getting her home alive, and his partner Dracmon loves kinda prodding at Kaito just a little too much, peeling away at his abrasive exterior. Aoi, the mother character, has a partner in Labramon, a fairly reserved monster who doesn't strictly have parallel themes, but works more as an enabler. She encourages Aoi to lean into her more nurturing role, which is much needed. She's the carer, the cook, a beacon of softer guidance and protection. Saki puts on the appearance of an airheaded ditz, and then drops it the second someone pisses her off. She will fire back with immense passion. Floramon is her companion and is effectively Saki, but slightly more reserved and in Digimon form. Then there's Miyu, and she's a bratty kid, but Syakomon, that sounds wrong. Syakomon seems to go along with it, appearing equally if not more childish. Despite Miyu's more petulant nature, she still functions as an authority figure for her partner, giving her command over at least something. The females of the group don't stay non-complex, but on a surface level, their monsters serve a different purpose to the male characters. But then of course there's Takuma's partner Agumon, who is just Takuma in Digimon form, but way more likable. His interjections are always positive. He's happy, he's a little ball of sunshine, I love Agumon, and so do you. These characters are as single-minded as they are single-toned. They're always having one conversation at any given time. I understand the core focal point is going home and not dying, but have you ever been in a room with more than 5 people? It very rarely stays on topic. You've got multiple conversations happening at once, but visual novels can't really convey that, so everyone's always hanging on this singular string of words. You put 10 people in that room, they'll remain inanimate, unblinking, a void of anime exposition waiting for their turn in line, which bleeds into the sequences where they're traversing. The group like to think they're modern explorers, but any movement is conveyed through text, a narrative flow-on with little interactivity, oftentimes stopping you just so you can click the next guy to progress the story. There was a perfect opportunity to give the player slight amounts of manual control in regards to exploration, even something basic. It would have benefited heavily from using a more diegetic approach. Connect the maps together through the maps themselves with defined waypoints instead of going back to a menu with the world map view. Make the exploration feel a bit more connected, give people a better idea of the tangible layouts of the world we're trapped in. The world map is handy for a general location, but it can't piece areas together as well as experiencing movement through them. Sword of Hope for the original Game Boy takes cues from old first-person CRPGs, executing a similar idea pretty well. It doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, it just has to be. I use Sword of Hope as an example as it managed this back in 1989 with a screen resolution of 160 by 144. What is your excuse? This idea was flirted with no more than twice, in the sewers and the hall before the throne room. Unfortunately, the sewers are reused maps that are solely to demonstrate that a monster has become the master of disguise, and the throne room existed to show you that alternate paths exist in the contextual movement system they opted not to use. The way I see it, if you're going to gamify a visual novel, you've got to do it in every aspect and not just create a disconnected system like RPG combat and menus. It speaks to an issue with the need for game progress or number progress in that it heavily conflicts with the narrative and actively fights it. You know from the user interface that the story has to continue for a certain amount of time, that Digimon are owed their later forms to some degree because you can see it in the evolution tab. I can see War Greymon, look, he's right there. This is fine in a regular game, you assume you're going to hit the monster's ultimate forms or mega forms, but in a suspense-driven narrative mystery like Digimon Survive, the hooks that bind are only as ensnaring as what's in their direct proximity. That is to say, if your game systems reveal leading information in a thriller mystery narrative, you need to obscure them. I never thought I'd say this, but Survive would benefit heavily from being less of an RPG. Oh god, just vomited in my mouth. This is one thing the original Digimon world excelled at. You are never owed progress, you have to earn it. Is it always fair? No, it's actively punishing at times, particularly for newer players, but you're rarely given information that would lead you to expect an outcome. Should Survive have had more of an oppressive atmosphere? I ought not dictate the vision of other men. But when your core themes are of mortality and the fragility of the human mind, yeah, maybe. This is the natural progression of a nearly 30-year-long series like Digimon, where a majority of your players are already familiar with monsters and themes and narratives and all that. It's truly a double-edged sword, where you don't want to retread the origin story per se, but you also don't want people to know exactly what they're getting ahead of time. For a series this established, it's a losing game no matter what decision you make, you're fucked either way, which is why Survive, hinging on its half-gamified narrative, completely falls flat. It's far too familiar to evoke the pure novelty it's going for, which is kinda sad in a way. It confines the future of the series to a box, where it's just Digimon story again, but shinier and more like Persona each time. Gone are the days where systems and worlds would be entirely reinvented, where the average Digimon game was a 4 out of 10 at best. We're in peak safety era. You see it in the general reaction to modern digital monster titles. We're banking on a fun, well-made hit which inherently conflicts with Survive's ethos of killing children. Also, visual novels just suck, bro. I know you goon to amputee girls, but you can do that without 1,000 unrelated text boxes. The uppercase I internet is as boundless as your degeneracy. Up until around the 5th chapter, there's a decent pace. We're fed some intrigue, some abrasive foes, the characters are making some sort of new norm in this world. Everything's kinda sinking in. Ryo and Shinji have both died, 2 staples removed from the game. Ryo's death is a bit histrionic, a bit dramatic, but it makes sense. He's a coward, mentally broken. He embraced his own death through the futility found within that cowardice. Inaction in a survival situation is a death sentence. Shuuji followed directly as he saw Digimon as things that couldn't be trusted and lamented his own failures as the leader he saw himself to be through the lens of this small, weak creature glaring his own insecurities back at him. This neglect saw his own breakdown, which coupled with the physical and mental abuse thrown towards Lopmon made his monster go completely insane, transform into an evil Wendigomon, and then Shuuji got his ass ate. But he tastes like shit too. These are both unique, brutal ways to die, but I'd say Shuuji deserved it, and so would you. Ryo's death was a little more nebulous, as its purpose was twofold. It fully demonstrates the consequence of not surviving, while introducing the severity of the miasma, the killer fog. We are introduced to it prior, as the cast flee multiple times, and it's responsible for killing foes, cementing it as an ultimately neutral force of chaos. However, Ryo's death is where the permanent consequences are cemented. He's just gone, vanished, dead. It's less that he died and more that getting dragged into this portal of hands seems far less definitive than being eaten by Wendigomon. Shinji's screams of agony are pretty definitive, and we like that for him. Chapter 6 is easily one of the worst. We're now doubting the safety and trust of being friends with our Digimon, despite the Wendigomon incident literally being caused as a result of questioning the bonds of your monster. The start of the chapter, everyone's in a tizzy. Can I truly trust this creature that's kept me alive for so long? Before painfully arriving at the answer, which is an obvious yes. By chapter 7, we can now employ ultimate transformations through unimportant side quests if characters have high enough affinity. I don't remember what happened in the chapter itself. It was probably cringe. No longer are monster transformations locked behind major narrative events, which speaks to how they clearly ran out of the need for more power and just kinda gave it to you. The nebulous gamification strikes again. Chapter 8 is the final point of a narrative fork you are unaware you were on, and the seal on this ancient evil is weakening, which sees the island at risk of being flooded by the killer fog. This is where things start ramping up, getting exciting. Unforeseen events in my thriller mystery narrative get out of town. There's a fight with Piedmon, and it's actually difficult because I remember thinking, where did this come from? And why aren't all the battles like this? From here, we can leave everyone behind, head to the real world, and just stay there, which gives us the coward ending, but I don't know, at what point do you just cut your losses? Agumon gives me a sad look as he returns to the digital world, and honestly, that made me regret even attempting it. His shame worked on me. It's also where your accumulated karma proves its consequence and locks you into a path. You're given a curtailed set of choices based on your responses to various questions throughout the game, which also dictates how Agumon feels about you and his evolution path. That's the entire point of the karma system. Gamified, bipolar, third word that drives the point home. Getting back to the digital world, Chapter 9 fakes us out. It reckons it's going to ramp up, and then we get stuck in a library with illusions, tricksters who dissolve when we reveal them, or something, which is effectively what happened in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 sees us wandering around some sewers, constantly engaging with an evolving doppelganger, but his mimicry is easily seen through. Each time we foil his plot, he gets madder and better in his disguise, but despite dialogue options to weed him out sooner, there are no penalties for playing the fool. Much in the same way that Chapter 9 has a bunch of kids fight with illusions of a true part of their deep, concealed inner selves that they have to overcome to truly contain them. It's padding, treading the same beats to a heavily diminishing effect. We've seen both the persona motif and the clones appearing to sow doubt. Get an original idea or cut the fluff. The whole point of it, the whole setup, is to sell the two following deaths. You either lose Saki or Miyu, and I lost Saki. Before she dies, we learn she was in a hospital and has to have a mystery operation, which instead of learning naturally through social osmosis is crammed in as very forced flashbacks before she's killed off by wandering into fog to save Digimon that aren't there. The game also spoiled Aoi's death as I saved during the library scene and she was absent from the title, but we all saw it coming. She absolutely broke, went completely nuts. I said at the start the narrative is so choreographed, it's unreal. This was clearly the point. They realized no one had died in this survival game in several chapters, so we had to awkwardly cram some in there at the last minute. Aoi confesses it was stupid as she encouraged Saki to die through her actions. Man, that female competition is nasty, bro. The guilt consumes her. She goes crazy. Somehow her unshakable feminine malice turns her into a demon that wants to implement the exact same plan as every anime villain where there's this perfect world free of harm and strife. Her world would ultimately end up existing by merging the worlds. Monsters and humans are stuck together, no longer segregated, but the mass importation of monsters completely breaks down social cohesion. The whole place is on fire. Entirely new classes of human and monster are created based on, unknown powers, which breeds prejudice and conflict, once and for all objectively proving that utopian ideals only work within established and like-minded in-groups. That was her intent, right? Then the gang assaults a cop, and according to modern Japanese RPGs, this makes them the good guys. Persona is to JRPGs as Dark Souls was to the gaming industry as a whole. A complete fucking disaster. We've spoken a lot about major narrative moments, but I found the smaller ones sold me on the world more than someone dying or major revelations. The girls wanting their own private spaces to sleep and to change was an interesting beat, as of course teenage girls would want their privacy, but it came after they were kidnapped by a giant spider. In an adult-populated narrative, we'd likely see the characters forego their privacy for security. What's the point of hiding your shame if you'll die for it? You know what, they probably made the right call. I bet Shuuji would have raped him and then be like, no, you actually raped me. Along the same vein, being in a forest in a rundown school building for weeks, the topic of food is brought up a handful of times, but that's what you should be focused on, not speculating about the island or exposing which the two dead ghost kids are bad for. Oh my god, I haven't even talked about the fucking dead ghost kids. They're both special and are used to further the narrative. One's secretly a Digimon and the old guy is the kid who is a Digimon pretending to be a kid. They are unimportant, they should have been cut because they suck. All they do is drag the player into exposition. That's literally all they do. Anyway, at the end of your forked narrative, New Game Plus is taunted. If only you were better at Tard wrangling Ryo, you'd be able to save everyone. But what value does that have when we know what really canonically happened? If you wanted me to change the events of the game, you wouldn't dangle the New Game Plus carrot above my head and beg me to replay it. You would allow me to influence people in my first attempt. Despite my best efforts, through sheer internet osmosis, I learned the first playthrough was effectively pointless, which I think tinted my experience. Though I do wonder how betrayed I would have felt if I thought that my actions could influence anything and then got to the end only to realize that all the decisions are made up and the outcomes don't matter. As it stands, I think the story was fine, despite hating visual novels, and I believe the first run through is canon, that's my experience, and it was fine, probably above average for a JRPG adjacent story. However, I would be a shit recounter if we stopped there, so let's dive into New Game Plus. The second playthrough, the fabled second playthrough, it's not worth doing, which sucks, as the happy ending hinges on you caring enough to sit through a whole game a second time. As you've seen a majority of the content and small choices make no difference worth a damn, you can play through with the skip button on and consume your additional endgame content. I get what they were going for in an age where everyone wants the best ending on the first go around. They're not going to let characters get what they deserve. They won't see the brutal endings of their own agency. They're going to look up a perfect playthrough guide and have their hand held through an optimized run of the game in fear they will miss something. People are fundamentally broken in the brain. Oh my god, imagine experiencing something blind and not getting the exact ending that you idealized. Conceptually, multiple endings aren't designed as a punishment where vague missables lock you out of content. It's a way to customize player experience and give closure to a free molded playthrough. That said, no one plays games blind anymore, so when they see Survive in the title, they are going to spoil it for themselves in fear of missing out. How do you combat that as a game designer? Well, if they won't let your characters suffer, you make the player suffer. I enjoyed my first time around, it had some pretty gnarly issues, but it still felt impactful. I remembered the fatal flaws everyone made, and the overall tone felt dire. At any time, anything could happen, and how I reacted could influence that. When you end up saving Ryo and Shinji and realize that maybe 5% of the dialogue is slightly tweaked and events don't differ until the end of the game, you've got to ask, why bother with the entire second playthrough? If the events were majorly different, you could see the second playthrough not as a New Game Plus, but as the back half to a full narrative. It's 2 playthroughs in spirit only. What it actually ends up being is an incredibly gamified, check-boxed narrative of all the shit I've got to do for it to be any different. The major turning point is keeping Ryo alive, and once he secures his existence, he becomes the new main character, saving everyone else from all their own tortures and torment. That's right, once Ryo realizes that crying doesn't achieve anything, that no amount of pleading or weighing up responses matters, he simply chooses to bully everyone into submission, and as a result, we get the happy ending. Remember kids, early and often. If you're not using a guide, keeping Ryo alive is effectively save scumming until you've given the answers he wants to hear. Once he's above 30 affection, the rest of the game's free and you have locked in the good ending. He bullies Shuuji into not beating Lopmon, bullies Saki into not getting grabbed by the ghoulies. His entire redemption arc is a confession that the in-game choices are so weak they bend to exactly whatever the narrative demands, and Ryo happens to be the final call on whatever that may be. You could ask, why bother? It's a great question. Why add options that do very little in the first run? And my answer is obviously to keep the illusion. If you think you can affect major events, you're going to marry your choices more, though I do think less choices might have gone a long way, and more intentional dialogue and events would have been better in the first run, and then drop all the extra shit on the second run so it feels a bit more novel. Half the time, the 3 options you're given are effectively the same thing, worded slightly differently, except for when you tell Miyu there's a snake behind her, but really the snake is the developers and nothing you do matters at all. I'm shitting on the second run, but it was solely worth it to see Ryo's glow up and to see him cry when he hears Kunemon talk for the first time, which is kind of like a full actualization of his character arc. What a fucking dude, I love him. Shinji still sucks though. What is it with dudes called Shinji? He does attempt to mend his ways and everyone forgets that he abused and mentally tortured an animal, but he's still a charisma void, a painfully adherent Japanese worker bee, and I think Ryo should have clocked him a few more times. The true ending itself pales in comparison to Ryo having his moment. It's also not really worth it unless you want to doze people, which I guess I'm one because I played through twice to get the second ending. It's really nothing special. The world merges, but everyone's happy instead of sad. There are 4 seals with mega strong monsters you can inherit the powers of, and more sistercon shit, and that's it. Legit, the bad endings are way more interesting, and I hate visual novels and hope to never play one again. Bye!